The silence is what you notice first. It is not a peaceful silence, but a heavy, watchful one that presses down on the curved tile roofs of the Forbidden City. You have lived within these vermilion walls for 3 years, the face among hundreds. Innate, the silence is broken by the soft, deliberate tread of felt minus soled slippers on the stone courtyard outside your pavilion. They are coming for you. There is no joy, no flutter of excitement, methodical stripping of your garments by expressionless attendants, the wrapping of your body in a thick, silken quilt, leaving nothing exposed but your head and neck. You are no longer a person. You are an offering, a vessel. As you are carried through the labyrinthine corridors by 2 impassive eunuchs, their grip firm, their faces blank, you understand your true function. You are cargo, destined for the Emperor's bed, a participant in a ritual as old and as cold as the Empire itself. This experience, or one very much like it, was the systemic reality for countless women who entered the service of the King Court. Before we unseal the official records of this meticulous system, consider this a moment to register your presence. A-like serves as your signature on our research log, and a subscription grants you access to all future findings provided you believe that even the most uncomfortable truths of history must be brought into the light. We invite you to share your thoughts on who you believe to be the most misunderstood figure in history. The time for speculation has passed. Let the shadows gather, and we shall now piece together the fragmented clues. Within the sprawling, high-walled complex of the Forbidden City in Beijing, there existed a small, unassuming, yet immensely powerful administrative body. It was known as the Jing Shi Fang, or the Chamber of Imperial Affairs. To the uninitiated, its name suggested mundane clerical duties, a place for managing documents, or scheduling court appointments. Its actual function was far more specific and of paramount importance to the stability of the dynasty. Staffed exclusively by a select group of eunuchs, was charged with the complete and total management of the emperor's intimate life. It was not a ministry of pleasure, but a bureau of biological and political control. Its sole purpose was to regulate the process of procreation at the highest level of the state, ensuring the purity and legitimacy of the imperial bloodline. The Chamber of Imperial Affairs operated under the vast umbrella of the Imperial Household Department, the government agency responsible for managing all aspects of the emperor's domestic life, his family, and his servants. Yet, the chamber's remit was the most sensitive of all. It was, in essence, the institutionalization of the emperor's reproductive capacity. The body of the emperor and the bodies of his consorts were not considered their own private domains, they were assets of the state. The union between them was not an act of personal affection but a state-sanctioned procedure, and the Chamber of Imperial Affairs was the bureaucratic instrument that governed every step of that procedure. Its authority superseded personal desire, romantic inclination, or even the emperor's own momentary whims. Every encounter was subject to its rigorous protocols, every outcome meticulously recorded in its ledgers. The selection of eunuchs as the sole administrators of this chamber was a calculated and critical element of its design. As men who could not father children, they were perceived as neutral parties in the relentless dynastic struggles over succession. A court official with sons of his own might be tempted to conspire with a favored concubine to advance his family's interests. A eunuch, theoretically, had no bloodline to promote. This perceived neutrality made them the ideal custodians of the imperial succession process. They were the sterile guardians of the ultimate source of fertility. This unique position granted the high-ranking eunuchs of the Chamber of Imperial Affairs a paradoxical form of power. They were physically incomplete men who held absolute authority over the process that created the empire's future sons and heirs. They were servants, yet they dictated the most intimate conditions of their master's life. The functions of the chamber were threefold: administration, supervision, and documentation. Administratively, they managed the roster of all eligible consorts and empresses, presenting the emperor with his nightly options through a carefully capacity. They prepared the chosen woman, transported her to the imperial bedchamber, and, most critically, monitored the duration of the encounter from just outside the door. Their role did not end there. They performed their documentary function, recording the date, the time, and the name of the woman in a special register. This was more than mere record-keeping. It was the creation of an official ledger of conception, a document that would serve as incontrovertible proof of a potential heir's legitimacy. This process transformed the imperial bedchamber from a private space into a clinical environment, a biological laboratory where the future of the dynasty was forged under strict observation. The Chamber of Imperial Affairs was the cold, bureaucratic heart of the Forbidden City's inner court, a place where human biology was subordinated entirely to the implacable logic of state power. This meticulous bureaucracy was not born of sadism or prurience, but from a foundational anxiety that haunted every Chinese dynasty, the existential dread of a disputed succession. For an empire as vast and complex as that of the king, a stable and unambiguous transfer of power was the single most important guarantor of its continuity. The alternative was chaos, civil war, and the potential collapse of the mandate of heaven, the philosophical and political doctrine that legitimized the emperor's rule. The entire edifice of the state rested upon the belief that the emperor was the chosen son of heaven, and this celestial mandate was passed down through his blood. Any ambiguity, any whisper of doubt concerning the paternity of an heir, could be weaponized by rival factions within the court or by warlords in the provinces. A single rumor could splinter the bureaucracy, fracture the military, and plunge the empire into a period of catastrophic internal conflict. The king rulers, being of Manchu descent and governing a predominantly Han Chinese population, were particularly sensitive to any perceived weakness or internal division. Their legitimacy was always under a greater degree of scrutiny than that of their Han predecessors. A succession crisis would not only be a political disaster but also an open invitation for rebellion, as it would be interpreted as a sign that the king had lost the divine favor required to rule. Preventing such a crisis was not merely a matter of family planning, it was a matter of national security. The Chamber of Imperial Affairs was the institutional solution to this paramount political problem. It was a preemptive strike against the very possibility of illegitimacy. The system's logic was cold and absolute. To secure the bloodline, one had to control its source. This meant isolating the emperor's reproductive capacity from all external variables and potential contaminants. The inner court was a political ecosystem teeming with the ambitions of powerful families, each represented by a daughter or niece serving as an imperial consort. A child born to a concubine was not simply an heir to the throne, he was a potential vehicle for the ascendancy of his mother's clan. If a consort from the powerful Li clan gave birth to the crown prince, the influence and power of the Li family would skyrocket, shifting the entire balance of power within the court. This created a relentless, high-stakes competition where a pregnancy was the ultimate prize. In such an environment, the temptation for deception was immense. A consort, in collusion with her family or a court official, might attempt to introduce an illegitimate child into the imperial line, passing it off as the emperor's own. While difficult, the potential rewards for such a scheme were immeasurable. The Jing Shi Fang was designed to make this scenario an impossibility. The meticulous record minus keeping the imperial ledger detailing the exact date and time of every encounter created an unimpeachable chain of evidence. The conception of any legitimate heir had to correspond perfectly with a documented visit recorded in the chamber's books. Any child whose gestation period did not align with the ledger would be immediately suspect. Furthermore, the ritualized transportation and supervision of the consort served to eliminate opportunity. By having the woman stripped of her own clothes examined and wrapped in a quilt, the eunuchs ensured she could not conceal any weapons or unauthorized items. By carrying her directly to the emperor's bed and retrieving her immediately afterward, they created a closed loop, a sterile corridor in time and space where no other man could have possibly had access to her. The eunuchs waiting outside the bedchamber were not merely there to enforce a time limit, they were official witnesses, their presence confirming that the state-sanctioned procedure was followed without deviation. The system was an intricate political lock, designed to protect the dynasty's most precious asset. It treated the imperial succession not as a matter of human relationships, but as a quasi-scientific process to be conducted under controlled laboratory conditions, with the eunuchs serving as the technicians. The fear of a polluted bloodline and a resulting civil war was so profound that it justified this extreme level of surveillance and control, transforming the most private of human acts into a public, bureaucratic ritual. At the apex of this rigidly controlled system sat the emperor, the son of heaven, a figure theoretically possessed of absolute power. His edicts could raise armies, levy taxes, and decide the fate of millions. He was the central axis around which the entire empire revolved, a quasi-divine entity whose authority was, in principle, limitless, yet within the confines of his own bedchamber. This absolute monarch was subject to a form of regulation so profound that it challenged the very notion of his omnipotence. In the specific context of procreation, the emperor ceased to be a sovereign individual and became, instead, a constitutional instrument. His body was the ultimate state resource, the point of origin for the dynasty's future, and as subject to the same dispassionate management as any other strategic asset. The Jing Shi Fang's protocols were designed to ensure that this asset was deployed correctly, efficiently, and for the sole benefit of dynastic continuity. This transformation of the emperor from person to function was a core principle of the Qing court's political philosophy. The individual man who occupied the dragon throne, his desires, his resentments were secondary to the office he held, while his preferences were, given some consideration in the nightly selection process, they were always filtered through the bureaucratic apparatus of the Chamber of Imperial Affairs. He could not, for instance, spontaneously summon a consort who had not been medically cleared or who was not on the approved roster for that evening. He could not engage in unscheduled or unrecorded liaisons. His personal will was subordinated to the political calculus of succession. This system was a constant, tangible reminder that his primary duty was not to himself, but to the ancestral spirits in the future of the empire. His role was not that of a husband or a lover in the conventional sense, but that of a biological catalyst, the essential element in a state-controlled chemical reaction. The very presence of the eunuchs as supervisors and timekeepers served to underscore this instrumentality. In no other area of his life would the emperor tolerate such close scrutiny. His policy decisions were debated by ministers in the formal setting of the outer court, but they were ultimately his to make. His meals were prepared and tested for poison, but he ate alone or with family. The act of procreation, however, was deemed too critical to be left to his own discretion. The eunuchs waiting outside the bedchamber, hourglass in hand, were physical manifestations interest in the proceedings. Their presence stripped the act of any semblance of privacy or romance, transforming the imperial bed into a stage for a prescribed performance. The emperor was the lead actor, but the script, the timing, and the final cut were all determined by the faceless bureaucracy of the chamber. This system effectively partitioned the emperor's being. In the grand halls of state, he was the ultimate authority. In the intimate darkness of his chambers, he was a functionary performing a critical state duty. The potential psychological effect of this duality is a matter of historical speculation, but the structure of the system points to a life of profound compartmentalities. Any genuine emotional connection he might have formed with a consort was rendered irrelevant by the protocol. A woman he might have truly favored was subject to the same impersonal processing as any other. This reality was a powerful tool for maintaining stability. It prevented the emperor from elevating one consort and her family to a position of unchecked power based on personal affection alone. It was a check against the kind of romantic entanglement that had, in previous dynasties, led to political instability in palace coups. By regulating the emperor's intimate life, the state was also regulating his emotional life, ensuring that his personal feelings could not override the strategic imperatives of the throne. Ultimately, the emperor was the most crucial, yet most constrained, component of the dragon seed. He provided an essence of the imperial line, but he had little to no control over its subsequent fate. As we shall explore, the final and most profound expression of his limited agency came after the act itself, when he was required to answer the eunuch's pivotal question. Even in this, his word was not the final command, but rather the input required for the next step in the bureaucratic process. He was the central gear, but he did not design the clockwork, nor could he stop its hands from turning. The emperor, in the service of his own lineage, was an instrument of the state, a sacred vessel whose contents were in his own hands. If the emperor was the primary instrument of dynastic reproduction, The women of the inner court were the vast and meticulously organized human resource from which the state would draw. This was a self-contained world known as the rear palace that existed in parallel to the male-dominated outer court of ministers and officials. On its surface, it was a place of serene beauty, with elegant pavilions, tranquil gardens, and exquisitely dressed women engaged in refined pursuit. Beneath this veneer of placid domesticity, however, lay a rigid, deeply hierarchical, and intensely competitive social ecosystem. The very architecture of this world was designed to channel the ambitions and energies of hundreds of women toward a single, state-sanctioned objective, bearing a legitimate heir for the dragon throne. The residents of this gilded cage were not, for the most part, chosen for love or beauty alone. They were the products of a political draft. The primary source of imperial consorts during the Qing Dynasty was the daughters of the Manchu elite, drawn from the military and administrative system known as the Eight Banners. Periodically, young women of eligible age from these prominent families were required to present themselves for inspection at the palace. This was not an honor to be declined. A selection process overseen by the Imperial Household Department and senior court women would identify candidates suitable for service to the emperor. To be chosen was to become a living link between one's family and the center of all power. These women were, from the moment they entered the Forbidden City's gates, representatives of their clans, their personal successes and failures reflecting directly upon the standing of their relatives in the outer court. Upon entering the inner court, each woman was assigned a rank within a complex and precisely defined hierarchy. At the apex was the singular empress, the official consort and the symbolic mother of the nation. Below her was a fixed number of senior consorts, with titles that could be translated as imperial noble consort, noble consorts, and consorts, and consorts. Below them were further tiers of imperial concubines, followed by female attendants and palace maids. This was not merely a system of titles, it was a complete social and economic stratification. A woman's rank determined every aspect of her existence, the size and location of her living quarters, the number of servants and eunuchs assigned to her, the quality and quantity of the silks she was permitted to wear, the daily stipend of silver she received, and even the type of food served at her meals. Advancement within this system was the primary occupation of every woman below the rank of empress. The path to promotion was narrow and fraught with peril. The principal currency was the emperor's favor. To be noticed by the emperor, to be chosen by him for a knight, was the first and most crucial step. This favor, however, was a fleeting and unpredictable resource, and competition for it was relentless. The conflict was rarely overt. It was a subtle war waged through cultivated talent in music, poetry, or painting, through the strategic formation of alliances with other women, and, critically, through the cultivation of relationships with the powerful eunuchs who controlled access and information flow. A well-placed word or a timely gift to a key eunuch in the Chamber of Imperial Affairs could mean the difference between languishing in obscurity and being brought to the emperor's attention. Ultimately, however, all other achievements were secondary to the single, overriding goal of pregnancy. Bearing a child for the emperor, particularly a son, was the only way to truly secure one's position and guarantee lasting influence. The mother of a prince, especially a potential crown prince, gained immense prestige and a degree of security that no other accomplishment could provide. Her rank would be elevated, her family honored, and her future secured. This biological imperative turned the inner court into a silent, high-stakes tournament. Each woman was a competitor, and her body was her primary asset in the dynastic contest. It was from this large and competitive pool of candidates, each with her own ambitions and family connections, that the Jing Shi Fang would make its nightly selection, reducing the complex web of human aspiration to a simple, administrative choice. The mechanism for initiating this nightly state-sanctioned union was as detached and administrative as every other aspect of the chamber's duties. The process typically began in the evening, after the emperor had concluded his official duties, reviewed the final memorials of the day, and taken his solitary meal. As the lamps whirled against the encroaching darkness, the chief eunuch of the Jing Shi Fang would make his appearance. He would not arrive with fanfare or announcement, but with the quiet, unobtrusive efficiency that was the hallmark of his office. He was a creature of routine and shadow, the high priest of a meticulously choreographed ritual. In his hands, or carried by a junior eunuch under his watchful eye, would be the central artifact of this nightly procedure, a large silver tray. Upon this tray, arranged in neat rows, lay a collection of thin plaques. These tablets, typically fashioned from polished ivory, bone, or bamboo, were the tangible representation of the emperor's potential partners. Each tablet bore the name of a consort who was deemed eligible for a visit on that particular evening. To be eligible, a woman had to be in good health, as confirmed by the imperial physicians, and not be in her menstrual cycle. These were the baseline biological requirements. The names inscribed were not simply a list of available women. They were a pre-minus approved roster, a curated selection that had already been filtered by the bureaucracy. The women whose families were out of favor, or who were themselves subject to some form of minor disciplinary action, might find their names conspicuously absent from the tray for weeks or months at a time. The most distinctive feature of these nameplates, and the source of their common name, was that the tip of each was painted a particular shade of green. They were the luti-ou-poi, the green-headed tablets. The emperor's role in this process was deceptively simple, reduced to a single physical gesture. He would survey the names presented to him on the silver platter. He could, if he wished, simply dismiss the eunuch, indicating no interest for the evening. He would reach out and turn over one of the green-headed tablets. This act of flipping the plaque, a silent and minimal action, set in motion a complex and irreversible chain of events. It was a command, an authorization, and a selection rolled into one. The name on the reverse side of that tablet now became the central focus of the entire inner court's machinery for the remainder of the evening. The chief eunuch would note the selection with a slight deferential bow. He would then carefully pick up the chosen tablet. His duty was to be a neutral facilitator, displaying no reaction, whether the emperor chose the same woman for the 10th night in a row, or a new consort who had waited years for this opportunity. The remaining tablets of the unchosen would be covered and taken away, their potential extinguished for another day. For the women they represented, it was another night of quiet waiting, another small failure in the ceaseless competition for relevance. For the woman who was chosen, her fate for the next few hours was now sealed and transferred into the hands of the Chamber of Imperial Affairs. The chief eunuch would then proceed from the emperor's quarters to the offices of the chamber. There he would hand the selected tablet to a subordinate eunuch, issuing a series of precise, low-voiced commands. This was the point where the abstract choice became a logistical operation. Runners would be dispatched. The consort's assigned pavilion would be notified. The imperial bathish would be prepared. Attendants would be mobilized, which had been in a state of quiet anticipation, would now begin to move with purpose. The single act of flipping a tablet had triggered a cascade of protocol-driven activity, all of it managed and overseen by the eunuchs of the Jing Shi Fang. The emperor had made his choice, but from that moment on, the procedure belonged entirely to them. The green-headed tablet was not a romantic invitation, it was a work order. Once the green-headed tablet was turned, the news would arrive at the chosen consort's pavilion not as a romantic summons, but as a procedural notification. A junior eunuch from the Chamber of Imperial Affairs, flanked by several senior palace maids, would appear at her doorway. His announcement would be brief, formal and devoid of emotion. The emperor had requested her presence. From that moment, the consort's personal agency was suspended. She was no longer the mistress of her own quarters, but a component being prepared for its designated function. A quiet, disciplined flurry of activity would commence, executed by a team that operated with the practiced efficiency of a surgical staff. The woman herself was expected to remain passive, compliant, and serene, a silent participant in her own preparation. The first stage was a ritualistic ablution. The consort would be led to a private bathing chamber where attendants had already drawn a deep tub of warm, scented water. This was not an act of pampering but a purification. The process was thorough and impersonal. Palace maids, women who had performed this task hundreds of times, would wash her body with meticulous care. The goal was to render her perfectly clean, a blank slate. Any personal perfumes were washed away, replaced by a subtle, officially sanctioned fluorescence. She was cleansed of any lingering scent of her own quarters, any trace of her individual, daily existence. Her hair was washed, combed until it was smooth, and then intricately styled, yet in a manner that was also functional and could be easily undone. Every part of this process was prescribed by tradition and protocol, designed to create a standardized, perfected object for imperial use. Following the bath, a meticulous physical examination was conducted. This was perhaps the most dehumanizing aspect of the entire ritual, carried out in a clinical and dispassionate manner, typically by senior, experienced palace maids or, in some cases, a female physician. The primary purpose was twofold. First, it was a final health check. The consort's body was inspected for any rashes, bruises, or signs of illness that might have been missed in earlier assessments. To present the emperor with a consort who was in any way unwell was a grave breach of protocol. She had to be in a state of perfect physical health, verified and confirmed just moments before the encounter. The second, and equally critical, purpose of this examination was security. The attendants would check for any concealed objects. In the high-stakes environment of the inner court, the possibility of a consort carrying a hidden weapon, a vial of poison, or even a magical charm intended to influence the emperor was a genuine concern for the guardians of the throne. The examination was therefore a thorough search. This intimate inspection reinforced the consort's status as a potential vector of danger, a body that had to be vetted and cleared before it could be granted access to the Son of Heaven. Her person was treated as a potential crime scene before any crime could be committed. She was presumed a threat until proven safe, a vessel that had to be checked for contaminants. The final step in this preparation was the complete removal of her own identity. Every hairpin, every jade bracelet, every silk robe that signified her rank and her personal taste was taken from her. She was stripped of all adornments, all markers of her position within the palace hierarchy. In this moment, the noble consort was indistinguishable from the lowest-ranking concubine. This act served a practical security purpose. Clothing could conceal weapons, but its symbolic weight was far greater. It was a process of depersonalization. She was not being presented to the emperor as Lady Focce or Consort Ulanara, a woman with a family name, a history, and a distinct personality. She was being reduced to her essential biological form, an anonymous female body made ready for a specific function. Stripped of identity, purified by water, and verified by inspection, she stood silent and unadorned, waiting for the eunuchs to complete the final stage of her delivery. She was a prepared offering, awaiting packaging. The final stage of this preparation was packaging. Once the consort was deemed clean and safe, the senior eunuchs from the Chamber of Imperial Affairs would enter, carrying the instrument of her transportation, a thick, heavy quilt, often woven with intricate patterns of dragons and phoenixes. This was not a simple blanket for warmth, but a purpose built to love containment and delivery. The consort was instructed to lie upon it, and the eunuchs would then proceed to wrap her body tightly within its fold. The technique was precise and practiced. She was enveloped completely from her feet to her neck, her arms pinned to her sides. The wrapping was snug enough to render her immobile, unable to move her limbs or even shift her position significantly. The only part of her left exposed was her head and, in some accounts, one bare shoulder, a small marker of the living person within the bundle. The primary and most explicit reason for this extraordinary method was, once again, security. The emperor was at his most vulnerable in the supposed privacy of his bedchamber. An assassin armed with a small, concealed blade could do irreparable harm in an instant. History provided ample cautionary tales of rulers who had met their end in their own beds. By binding the consort in this manner, the system neutralized her as a physical threat. She could not carry a weapon. She could not strike a blow. She was rendered utterly defenseless and therefore entirely safe. This protocol was the ultimate expression of the state's paranoia, a physical manifestation of the belief that anyone granted access to the imperial person was a potential assassin, until proven otherwise. The court was her temporary prison, ensuring the safety of the Son of Heaven. Beyond this practical logic, the symbolism of the act was profound. It was the final and most complete step in the process of depersonalization. A woman walking to the emperor's chamber, even if escorted, would retain a degree of personal agency. She would carry herself with her own grace or uncertainty. She would be a person arriving for an encounter. A woman carried in a quilt, however, was no longer a person in the conventional sense. She was an object, a piece of precious cargo being delivered. The act of being carried, of being unable to propel oneself, was a powerful statement of submission and powerlessness. It physically enacted her subordination to the emperor and, more accurately, to the institutional power of the throne that the eunuchs represented. The exposed shoulder served a dual purpose. It was a point of identification, ensuring the correct package was being delivered, and it was a final, stark symbol of her vulnerability, a patch of bare skin in a sea of controlled, impersonal fabric. The journey from her pavilion to the emperor's bedchamber was conducted in silence and with swift efficiency. The two eunuchs, selected for their strength and discretion, would lift the human bundle and move through the designated corridors of the Forbidden City. This was not a grand procession. It was a clandestine, logistical maneuver executed under the cover of darkness. They moved along routes known only to them, avoiding the main thoroughfares, ensuring that this transfer of a human body was witnessed by as few people as possible. The sleeping city with its tiered roofs and silent courtyards was the backdrop for this strange and recurring nocturnal ritual. The woman inside the quilt could only perceive the gentle swaying motion, see the lanterns passing overhead, and hear the soft, rhythmic footfalls of her bearers. Upon arrival at the emperor's bedchamber, the eunuchs would not simply leave her at the door. They would enter the room and proceed directly to the foot of the imperial bed. There, in the emperor's presence, they would place her upon the bedclothes. In a final, deferential movement, they would carefully unroll the quilt, revealing the consort who had been packaged within. Having completed their delivery, their task was not yet over. They would take the now empty quilt, bow deeply, and retreat from the immediate presence of the emperor. They would not, however, leave the area. They would exit the bedchamber itself, closing the doors behind them, and take up their next designated post in the antechamber, or just outside the entrance. Their role as couriers was complete. Their role as supervisors was about to begin. Having delivered the consort and retreated from the imperial bedchamber, the eunuchs of the Jing Shi Fang did not return to their own quarters. Their duty for the evening was only complete. They assumed a new role, transforming from couriers into sentinels. The chief eunuch, or a trusted high-ranking subordinate designated for this specific task, would take up a position just outside the closed doors. He was not there to eavesdrop for secrets or to indulge in voyeurism. He was there to perform a specific, non-negotiable bureaucratic function, to serve as the official timekeeper of the Imperial Union. In his hands, or placed on a small table beside him, was the instrument of this temporal regulation. It was often an hourglass, its glass bulbs containing a precisely measured quantity of fine sand, though in other periods a marked incense stick or a water clock might have served the same purpose. This was the cold heart of the chamber's supervisory power. The encounter between the emperor and his consort was not an open-ended affair to be dictated by mutual desire or the emperor's whim. It was a scheduled event with a predetermined duration. From the moment the doors to the bedchamber closed, the hourglass was turned, and the silent countdown began. The sand began its inexorable, whispering descent from the upper chamber to the lower, each grain marking a moment of state-sanctioned time passing. The presence of this time-keeping eunuch just outside the threshold was a constant, unspoken reminder that this was not a private act. It was a procedure being conducted on the state's clock, a process with a clear beginning and a clearly defined end. The logic behind this strict time limit was multifaceted, rooted in a combination of traditional medical theory, political pragmatism, and a deep-seated fear of emotional influence. From the perspective of traditional Chinese medicine, which heavily influenced the court's protocols, the emperor's physical vitality, his Jing, or seminalescence, was considered a finite and precious resource. It was directly linked to his health, his longevity, and his capacity to govern effectively. Excessive sexual activity was believed to deplete this vital energy, leading to physical weakness, mental fatigue, and a shortened lifespan. The time limit was therefore a form of medical prescription, a way to conserve the emperor's strength for his primary duties of ruling the empire. The Chamber of Imperial Affairs was, in this sense, acting as the guardian of the emperor's long-term health, ensuring that the biological act of procreation did not compromise the well-being of the head of state. More important, however, was the calculus of political control. The time limit was a powerful tool for preventing the emperor from developing a strong emotional attachment to any single consort. An extended, intimate encounter would allow for conversation, for the building of rapport, for the kind of personal connection that could translate into political influence. A consort who managed to captivate the emperor for hours on end could potentially become a trusted confidant. A whisper in his ear who could advocate for her family's interests, petition for promotions for her brothers, or slander her rivals in the inner court. This was the exact scenario the rigid bureaucratic system was designed to prevent. By keeping the encounters brief and focused on their biological purpose, the protocol ensured that the consort remained a fungible participant in a state ritual, not a potential power player. It maintained a level playing field in the inner court and prevented any one faction from gaining an advantage through the emperor's personal affection. As the last grains of sand trickled into the bottom bulb of the hourglass, the supervisory phase of the eunuch's duty reached its climax. At the precise, designated moment, he would break the silence. He would not knock deferential. He would call out in a clear, steady voice that was loud enough to be heard through the doors, "The time is up." It was the voice of the bureaucracy, of the system, asserting its ultimate authority. No matter the circumstances within, the emperor was expected to comply. This single, punctual announcement was the most potent demonstration of the limits of imperial power within this specific context. The emperor was the master of his own time when performing this particular duty. Having announced the conclusion of the allotted period, the eunuch would then wait for the summons to enter, to retrieve the consort, and to proceed to the final, and most critical, phase of the entire process. After the eunuch's cry of "the time is up" had pierced the stillness, a new kind of silence descended. It was a silence of anticipation during which the eunuch did not move. He remained at his post, his senses attuned to space beyond the carved wooden doors. His duty as a timekeeper had concluded, but his role as an observer continued. This period of waiting was not passive. It was a phase of intense, focused listening. This auditory surveillance was an official and indispensable part of the protocol, a layer of verification as crucial as the written ledger. The sounds emanating from the imperial bedchamber, or the lack thereof, were considered data, evidence to be gathered and mentally catalogued by the state's designated witness. This official listening served a primary, evidentiary purpose. The Jing Shi Fang's records were the ultimate arbiter of an heir's legitimacy, and those records needed to be beyond reproach. The eunuch's presence as an auditory witness provided a living confirmation that the state-sanctioned event had, in fact, been consummated. In a potential future dispute, a rival court faction might claim that the recorded encounter never truly happened, that the emperor and consort merely sat in the same room for the allotted time. The testimony of the supervising eunuch, who could attest to hearing what was colloquially and respectfully termed long yin, or the cries of the dragon, would serve as a powerful rebuttal to such claims. It provided an acoustic signature to the documented event, corroborating the entry in the ledger with sensory evidence. The second function of this auditory watch was security. The emperor was never considered truly safe, even in his own bed. The eunuch was listening not just for evidence of consummation, but for any sign of deviation from the expected sounds of the procedure. A sudden cry of a different nature, the sound of a struggle, a sharp metallic noise, any anomalous sound would be a signal for immediate intervention. The eunuch was the first line of defense, a human alarm system. He was trained to pass the acoustic environment of the chamber, to distinguish between the normal and the abnormal with unerring accuracy. This constant, low-level threat assessment transformed the antechamber into a listening post, a final security checkpoint guarding the emperor's life during his most unguarded moment. This duty required a unique and profound psychological discipline. The eunuch had to become an impersonal recording device, divorcing the sounds he heard from any emotional or personal context. He was not to be aroused, disgusted, or amused. He was to be a clinical observer, treating the sounds as one might treat readings from a scientific instrument. His own feelings were irrelevant. His duty was to the integrity of the system. This professional detachment was the very quality that made eunuchs suitable for the role in the first place. Their physical state was believed to foster an emotional neutrality that was essential for the impartial execution of their duties. They were the sterile observers of the empire's most fertile act. The act of listening also subtly inverted the power dynamic. The emperor inside the chamber was the subject of scrutiny. The eunuch outside the chamber was the agent of that scrutiny. For a brief, circumscribed period, the lowly servant held a form of observational power over the supreme ruler. He was the guardian of the rules, the enforcer of the schedule, and the official witness to the act. His memory of the event, backed by the authority of the Chamber of Imperial Affairs, would become part of the official historical record. The emperor was creating the heir, but the eunuch was creating the proof. He would remain at his post silent and motionless until he was summoned to Re Minor Center. Only then would his auditory surveillance end, and the final, most consequential phase of his nightly duty would begin. The emperor's signal to Re Minor Center would be subtle, a soft clap, a cleared throat, but the eunuchs waiting outside were attuned to it with absolute focus. At the sound, the doors would swing open silently, and they would Re Minus enter the imperial bedchamber with the same quiet, purposeful discipline with which they had left. The atmosphere within the room was not one of lingering intimacy but of procedural finality. The state-sanctioned time had elapsed, and the next phase of the protocol was due to commence. The two junior eunuchs would proceed directly to the imperial bed, their faces impassive. The consort, who was expected to be waiting, would once again assume a passive role as they covered her and draped her back into the heavy silken quilt, securing the folds just as they had before. This Re Minus wrapping was a powerful symbolic act. It signaled the definitive end of the personal encounter and construct cargo. She was once again an object to be managed and removed by the bureaucracy. While the consort was being packaged for her return journey, the chief eunuch would separate from his subordinates. He would approach the emperor, who might now be sitting on the edge of the bed or have moved to a nearby chair, perhaps having donned a loose silk robe. The chief eunuch would perform a deep, formal bow, his eyes fixed on the floor in a gesture of profound deference. Then, in the still, heavy air of the chamber, he would pose the most critical question of the entire ritual. His voice would be a low, steady monotone, devoid of inflection or curiosity. It was a formal, administrative inquiry, the verbal component of a bureaucratic checklist. He would ask, in the formal language of the court, for the emperor's decree to keep or not to keep. This was the imperial question of retention. It was a query of immense, almost unfathomable weight, delivered with the dispassionate tone of a clerk confirming a transaction. The subject of the question was the emperor's dragon seed, the potential for a new life that had just been created. The emperor was now required to make an immediate, binding decision on the fate of this potential conception. His answer was not a suggestion or a preference. It was a direct and final order to the Chamber of Imperial Affairs. This moment was the ultimate nexus of the emperor's personal will and the state's biological machinery. It was here that a potential heir was either officially sanctioned or preemptively erased from existence. The emperor's decision would be based on a complex matrix of political, strategic, and sometimes personal considerations. A consort from a family whose power was growing too rapidly might be denied the chance to produce an heir, as a means of checking her clan's ambition. Conversely, the emperor might wish to sire a child with a woman from a less powerful family to avoid concentrating influence in one faction. There was a delicate balance of power to be maintained among the various Manchu clans, and the birth of a prince was the single heaviest weight that could be placed on that scale. The emperor might also be following a long-term plan, aiming for an heir from the empress or a high-ranking consort, and therefore choosing to prevent conceptions with women of lower rank. His decision, therefore, was rarely a spontaneous one. It was a calculated political act, a move in the perpetual grand strategy of dynastic management. Upon arrival, the consort would be taken into a small, scrupulously clean, and sparsely furnished room. There was no art on the walls, no ornate furniture. The space was purely utilitarian, containing little more than a firm, padded table, a cabinet for supplies, and a wash basin. This was a clinical environment, deliberately stripped of any semblance of comfort or domesticity. Here, the consort was unrolled from her quilt for the final time that night. She was no longer a potential mother of an emperor, but a vessel that required administrative cleansing. She was instructed to lie down on the table, and her compliance was assumed. The procedure that followed was the physical actualization of the emperor's command. It was not performed by a physician, as that would introduce an external agent into the chamber's closed system. Instead, the task was carried out by a senior eunuch, one who had been specially trained in a very particular set of physiological techniques. These techniques were rooted in the principles of traditional Chinese medicine, but they were repurposed for a uniquely political application. The eunuch was not a healer, he was a functionary, an administrator whose tool was his knowledge of the human body's pressure points and internal mechanics. His task was to ensure the emperor's verbal decree was translated into an irreversible biological reality. The method was known as the application of external force. The eunuch, using his hands and a precise knowledge of anatomy as it was then understood, would apply deep, sustained, and often rhythmic pressure to a specific point on the consort's lower abdomen. This point, referred to in medical lore as a critical meridian or energy gate, was believed to be directly connected to the womb. The underlying theory was that by stimulating this point with sufficient force, one could disrupt the internal environment of the uterus, trigger powerful muscular contractions, and thereby compel the body to expel its contents. The objective was clear and brutally simple: to force the evacuation of the emperor's seminal fluid before it had any chance of leading to conception. It was a form of primitive, physically induced emergency contraception. The consort was a passive participant in this process. There was no question of consent. She was an asset of the state, and her body was being subjected to a state-minus mandated procedure. The eunuch performing the task would do so with a focused, impersonal efficiency. It was a physical and demanding process, requiring both strength and precision, but it would have been carried out with the same dispassionate ear as filing a document or grinding ink. It was a job, a step in a protocol. The woman on the table was simply the work site. The physical stress of the procedure would have been considerable, but any sound she made would have been absorbed by the thick walls of the chamber, remaining an unrecorded detail in an official process. After the eunuch was satisfied that the procedure had been effective, the consort would be cleaned by waiting palace maids and likely given a bitter herbal decoction. This drink was also part of the protocol, a traditional formula believed to further cleanse the womb and restore its normal balance. Once she had recovered sufficiently to walk, she would be dressed in a simple robe and escorted back to her own pavilion under the watchful eyes of the eunuchs. She would return not in a quilt, but on her own feet, her temporary elevation to imperial partner now definitively concluded. Back in the offices of the Jing Shi Fang, the chief eunuch would make one final entry in the ledger for the night. Beside the consort's name, the date, and the record of the encounter, he would add a final annotation, confirming that the emperor's order of BUU had been received and the prescribed cleansing procedure had been successfully administered. The bureaucratic loop was now closed. The state's control over its own genesis was, for another night, absolute. The final stroke of the eunuch's brush, recording the execution of the emperor's decree, was far more than a simple clerical note. It was the closing of a file, the final punctuation mark on a state-control biological event. The document he was writing in, this imperial ledger of intimacy, was the ultimate product of the Chamber of Imperial Affairs work. It was a tangible manifestation of the system's power, a silent, unblinking chronicle of the dynasty's most secret and essential function. The ledger itself was an object of immense significance. It was not a common account book, but a finely crafted register, typically bound in imperial yellow silk, a color reserved for the emperor and made with the highest quality paper, designed to resist the decay of centuries. The data entered into this register was precise, minimal, and stripped of all extraneous detail. Each entry was a masterpiece of bureaucratic reductionism, converting a human interaction into a series of verifiable data points. The first column would contain the date recorded according to the imperial calendar, the reign year of the emperor, the lunar month, and the specific day. This was followed by the hour, noted using the traditional to-hour system. Next came the name and official rank of the consort who had been chosen. These three pieces of information, date, time, and identity, form the foundational record of the event. They established a clear and unambiguous timeline that could be cross-referenced with medical records and other court logs. The next column was the most critical, the emperor's decree. Here, the eunuch would inscribe the character for the you do not keep. This single entry determined the entire subsequent chain of events. If the order was retention, the record stopped there, implicitly sanctioning any potential pregnancy that might result. If the order was non-retention, a fifth column was required, an annotation confirming that the prescribed cleansing procedure had been administered by the chamber's personnel. The final mark on any entry was the personal seal or signature of the supervising chief eunuch. This mark served as an authentication, a guarantee of the record's accuracy, and a formal assumption of responsibility by the eunuch for the veracity of the information contained within. This ledger was, in essence, the most important legal document concerning imperial succession. It held a status far surpassing any personal testimony or claim. In the event of a dispute over a prince's paternity, this register would be the final and absolute arbiter. A prince whose conception date, calculated backwards from his birth, did not align perfectly with a keep entry associated with his mother in the ledger would be instantly delegitimized. The ledger provided an unassailable defense for a legitimate heir whose parentage was challenged by a rival faction. It was the dynasty's ultimate birth certificate, created before the moment of conception itself. Its authority was absolute because it was created in real time by a supposedly neutral third party, the eunuch, and it chronicled an event to which he was the state's sole official witness. Given its immense political importance, the ledger was one of the most heavily guarded documents in the Forbidden City. It was not stored in a general archive. It was kept under lock and key within the secure inner sanctum of the Chamber of Imperial Affairs. Access to it was restricted to the highest ranking eunuchs of the chamber and, by extension, the emperor himself. No court minister, no imperial relative, and certainly no consort could demand to see its contents. It was a classified document of the highest order, a silent repository of dynastic secrets. By controlling this single book, the chamber controlled the official history of the imperial bloodline. They were not merely clerks, they were the archivists of the dynasty's genesis, the gatekeepers of its most fundamental truth. The entries within its pages, written in cold, precise calligraphy, were the building blocks of legitimacy, each stroke of the brush a confirmation of the state's absolute power over the bodies of those who served it. The seal of the chief eunuch, pressed in vermilion ink beside the final entry in the ledger, was more than a mark of authentication. It was the signature of the system's ultimate human operator. While the emperor was the source of the biological material and the consorts were the vessels, the chief eunuch of the Chamber of Imperial Affairs was the institutional fulcrum upon which the entire apparatus turned. Outwardly, he was the model of a perfect servant, silent, deferential, his movements economical and his presence unobtrusive. Yet, this carefully cultivated veneer of subservience concealed a form of power that was as profound as it was unofficial. He was the living embodiment of the chamber, a man whose personal authority became indistinguishable from the institutional might he directed. This authority was a classic example of shadow power. It did not derive from a noble title, a military command, or a high-ranking ministerial portfolio that would be discussed in the outer court. Instead, it grew organically from the unique and strategic position he occupied at the intersection of the dynasty's most critical functions: sex, succession, and security. His power was not proclaimed in edicts, but was exercised in the quiet, administrative moments of his daily routine, in the selection of names to be placed on the silver tray, in the timing of his call outside the imperial bedchamber, and in the final, decisive stroke of his brush in the imperial ledger. He controlled the procedure, and in controlling the procedure, he influenced the outcome. The primary source of his influence was his absolute monopoly over access and information. As the manager of the green-headed tablets, he was the sole gatekeeper between the emperor's desire and the ambitions of every woman in the inner court. This seemingly simple administrative task was, in fact, an instrument of immense discretionary power. A consort's name could be accidentally left off the tray for a night or a week due to a minor, undocumented illness. A word from the chief eunuch to the emperor about a particular consort's radiant health or recent mastery of a poem could subtly guide the imperial gaze. He was the curator of the emperor's options. Furthermore, he was privy to information that no one else possessed in its totality. He knew the precise frequency of the emperor's encounters, the identities of his favored partners, and the secret decrees of retention or non-retention. This made him the most knowledgeable individual in the Forbidden City regarding the true state of the succession process, a form of intelligence that was priceless to the anxious, competing clans of the Manchu nobility. This gatekeeping role inevitably made the chief eunuch the focal point of a vast and complex network of patronage and corruption. The families of the consorts, desperate to secure their positions and advance their influence, understood that the path to the emperor's bed ran directly through the office of the Jing Shi Fang. Gifts of silver, jade, and other precious goods would flow into his possession in a steady, discreet stream. These were not seen as simple bribes, but as necessary investments in securing an opportunity. In return for this largesse, a family might find their daughter's name presented more frequently or placed in a more prominent position on the tray. The chief eunuch thus became an incredibly wealthy and well-connected figure, a broker of imperial favor who could build his own power base within the court, supported by a web of families who were indebted to him. His power was further solidified by his unique proximity to the emperor. No grand counselor or field marshal spent as much time in the emperor's private presence. He was the silent, efficient manager of the most personal aspect of the sovereign's life. This created a strange form of intimacy based not on friendship, but on function and discretion. The emperor came to rely on his quiet competence, on the seamless and trouble-free execution of this essential state ritual. A good chief eunuch made the entire complex and potentially awkward process disappear into a smooth, predictable routine. This reliability made him indispensable, and in that indispensability lay a subtle but powerful form of influence. He was a servant, but he was the master of a domain the emperor could not manage himself. He was a non-man, a biological dead-end, who held the keys to the future of the imperial bloodline. The immense shadow power wielded by the chief eunuch of the Chamber of Imperial Affairs existed in a symbiotic relationship with the carefully circumscribed authority of the emperor himself. For every measure of control the eunuch gained, a corresponding measure of personal freedom was taken from the Son of Heaven. The entire system, while designed to protect the emperor's lineage and the stability of his throne, achieved this by fundamentally limiting his personal agency in the very domain of that lineage's creation. The paradox of the king court was that the most powerful man in the empire was, in his most intimate moments, one of its most regulated subjects. He was not above the protocol, he was its central and most constrained component. This limitation began with the illusion of choice inherent in the ritual of the green-headed tablets. While the emperor performed the physical act of selection, he was choosing from a menu that had been prepared for him. He could not, on a whim, summon a consort whose name was not on the silver tray. He could not request a woman who was medically indisposed or who had been administratively sidelined by the chamber's eunuchs. His selection was confined to the approved list presented by the bureaucracy. This transformed the act of choosing a partner from an expression of personal desire into the ratification of a set of determined options. It was a subtle but profound constraint, ensuring that his choices always remained within the bounds deemed acceptable by the system's administrators. The most tangible and public expression of his limited agency was the temporal constraint imposed by the hourglass. The emperor's personal rhythm, his mood, his desires all were irrelevant in the face of the eunuch's inexorable schedule. The cry of the time is up was on negotiable command from the institution to the individual, a stark reminder that this procedure was not his to direct. He could not extend the encounter, nor could he cut it short without it being noted in the records. He was allotted a specific quantum of time to perform a specific state function, and he was expected to adhere to that schedule as rigorously as any clerk in the imperial bureaucracy. This transformed him from the master of the encounter into a participant bound by its rules. Furthermore, the complete absence of privacy was a constant condition of his intimate life. The knowledge that a supervising eunuch was just outside the door, listening and waiting, fundamentally altered the nature of the act. It could never be a truly spontaneous or private moment of connection. It was a performance for an audience of one, a state official whose purpose was to witness and record. This constant surveillance ensured compliance with protocol, but it also served to institutionalize a barrier between the emperor and his consorts. Genuine emotional intimacy is difficult to foster under observation. The system, by design, created an environment where such intimacy was unlikely to flourish, thereby protecting the emperor from the politically dangerous complications of love and affection. Finally, his agency was most profoundly curtailed in the moment of the post-coital question. The demand for an immediate, binding decision keep or not to keep removed any possibility of reflection, ambiguity, or later revision. He was forced into the role of a biological switch, making a choice with life minus or minus death consequences on the spot, a choice that would be instantly recorded and acted upon by an external administrative body. Decide to wait and see if a favored consort became pregnant and then retroactively legitimize the child. The system demanded an immediate, a priori decision. Even his most potent biological power, the ability to create an heir, was subject to this final bureaucratic checkpoint. His will was a necessary input, but it was the chamber's machinery that processed it and produced the final outcome. The emperor, in the service of the empire, was bound by the golden chains of his own sacred duty. The emperor's confinement within this ritualized system was mirrored by that of his partners, the hundreds of consorts and concubines of the inner court. On the surface, the structure of the Chamber of Imperial Affairs seems designed to render them utterly interchangeable, a collection of passive vessels to be selected, utilized, and then either cultivated or cleansed according to a bureaucratic directive. They were physically carried, stripped of their identity, and subjected to procedures over which they had no control. Yet, to assume that these women were simply powerless victims is to underestimate the resilience of human ambition and the subtle ways in which agency can be exercised even within the most rigid and oppressive of frameworks. The path to influence for a consort was not through open defiance, which was impossible, but through a masterful and discreet navigation of the system's own rules and pressure point. A woman's career in the inner court was a long and strategic campaign, and the primary battlefield was the perception of others. The first and most formidable obstacle was simply getting noticed, earning a place on the silver tray presented to the emperor each evening. This was not a matter of passive waiting. It required an active and sophisticated strategy of self-promotion, waged indirectly. The most critical element of this strategy was the cultivation of relationships with the eunuchs. Not just the powerful chief of the chamber, but the entire network of attendants, clerks, and messengers who were the eyes and ears of the inner court. A timely and generous gift to a junior eunuch might ensure that a consort's recent recovery from a minor illness was promptly reported to his superiors, making her eligible for selection again. A carefully nurtured alliance with a senior eunuch could result in him dropping a favorable comment about her skill in calligraphy or her gentle disposition in the emperor's hearing. These women managed their own intelligence networks, using their personal maids to gather information about their rivals, the emperor's moods, and the internal politics of the eunuch bureaucracy. Beyond the cultivation of these essential gatekeepers, a consort had to build her own brand. While the final encounter was brief, her reputation preceded her. A woman known for her exceptional musical talent, her profound understanding of the classics, or her skill at the strategic game of Go was more than just a name on a tablet. She was a distinct personality. This made her a more intriguing choice for the emperor, offering a brief respite from the monotony of identical encounters. These accomplishments were not mere hobbies. They were tools of statecraft, carefully honed to make a woman memorable and desirable within the narrow parameters of the selection process. Strategical alliances with other women were also crucial. Cliques and factions, often formed along family or regional lines, would work together, sharing information and sometimes even advocating for one another to their eunuch contacts. If a woman succeeded in being chosen, she faced the next great challenge, making the most of a severely limited window of opportunity. The time in the emperor's bedchamber was measured in minutes, not hours. Yet, a clever and perceptive consort could use this time to create a lasting impression that went beyond the physical act. A single, well-chosen sentence displaying wit and intelligence, a gesture of genuine empathy for the burdens of his office, or a display of serene grace under the unnatural circumstances of the ritual could set her apart. The goal was to transform herself in the emperor's mind from a generic consort into a specific and desirable individual, making him more likely to flip her green-headed tablet on subsequent nights. Ultimately, however, all of these efforts were directed toward a single, overriding objective, securing the emperor's decree to keep on successfully bearing a son. This was the only path to true, lasting power and security. A woman who became the mother of a prince underwent a fundamental transformation of her status. She was no longer merely a consort. She was a mater familiaris of a potential future imperial line. Her rank would be immediately and permanently elevated. Her family in the outer court would be showered with honors and titles. She would gain a measure of autonomy and respect within the inner court that was unattainable by any other means. She had fulfilled her highest biological and political function, and in doing so had transcended the status of a fungible object. She had become a power in her own right, a matriarch whose influence would have to be acknowledged for the rest of her life. Her success was a testament not to the system's benevolence, but to her own skill in navigating its treacherous currents. This strategic navigation of the inner court's politics was rarely a cost-free endeavor. The entire edifice of the Chamber of Imperial Affairs, while designed on paper to be a sterile and impartial bureaucracy, was operated by human beings. And within any system of absolute control where the stakes are astronomically high, a parallel economy of influence is almost certain to emerge. The immense discretionary power vested in the eunuchs of the Jing Shi Fang, from the chief administrator down to the junior clerks, created a fertile ground for corruption. This was not the flagrant, chaotic corruption of a failing state, but a subtle, institutionalized system of bribery that operated according to its own unwritten rituals. Favor became a currency, and access was a commodity to be bought and sold. The primary lubricant of this unofficial system was wealth. The great Manchu clans, whose daughters populated the inner court, were locked in a perpetual struggle for preeminence. They understood that the official stipends of even high-ranking eunuchs were modest compared to the immense power they wielded. Therefore, a steady and discreet flow of gifts was directed toward the key figures within the chamber. These were never explicitly labeled as bribe. They were presented as tokens of respect on major holidays, as offerings for the eunuch's birthday, or as expressions of gratitude for his diligent service. The medium of exchange varied. Crates of silver sises were common, but so were less traceable and more refined forms of wealth, rare pieces of carved jade, bolts of the finest silk, antique porcelain, and masterful works of calligraphy. The transactions operated on a clear, if unspoken, principle of reciprocity. A powerful family, like the FUC has, might ensure that the chief eunuch's personal quarters were discreetly renovated or that his adopted nephew received a favorable, low-level government post. In return, it was understood that the Fuch A consort's name might appear more frequently on the green-headed tablets, or that she might be presented on a night when the emperor was known to be in a particularly good mood. This transcational ecosystem extended to all levels of the eunuch hierarchy. A mid-level eunuch who was responsible for the physical preparation of the silver tray might receive a smaller, but still significant, gift to ensure a certain tablet was not placed at the very edge, where it was less likely to catch the emperor's eye. Even the lowest level eunuchs could be valuable assets. For a few pieces of silver, they could provide vital intelligence. Which rival consort was feeling unwell? What the emperor had praised at his evening meal? Or the current state of favor of the chief eunuch's various subordinates? This system was not a secret, it was an open secret, a fundamental and accepted part of the court's realpolitik. To not participate was to cede a critical advantage to one's rivals. The families that were less wealthy or less politically astute found their daughters languishing in obscurity, their names rarely, if ever, making it onto the silver tray, This meant that the supposedly impartial selection process was, in practice, heavily skewed in favor of the established and the affluent. It reinforced the existing power structures, making it exceedingly difficult for a woman from a minor clan to rise, no matter her personal merits. The system, designed to prevent any one family from gaining too much influence through the emperor's affection, inadvertently created a mechanism where influence could be purchased directly from its administrators. For the eunuchs, this stream of illicit income transformed their station. It allowed them to amass vast personal fortunes, which they could use to build their own networks of power, lend money, and acquire property through proxies outside the Forbidden City. This wealth provided them with a degree of security and autonomy that their official positions alone could not. However, it also placed them in a position of constant risk. The consequences could be fatal. The emperor could order a corrupt eunuch to be executed by the death of 1,000 cuts for abusing his trust. Therefore, the art of accepting a bribe was as refined as the art of offering one. It required immense discretion, subtlety, and a keen understanding of the shifting political tides within the court. The flow of silver, jade, and favors thus became as integral to the functioning of the chamber as the flow of sand in the hourglass, a silent, parallel system that governed the fate of women and the future of the empire. The intricate web of corruption that permeated the Chamber of Imperial Affairs was not merely a symptom of individual greed, it was an outgrowth of the unique and deeply paradoxical psychology of the men who ran it. To understand the functioning of the Jing Shi Fang is to examine the mindset of its gatekeepers. These were individuals who existed in a state of profound contradiction, occupying a space that was simultaneously at the pinnacle of influence and the nadir of social completeness. Their physical state defined their professional existence, creating a caste of administrators uniquely suited, both practically and psychologically, to the dispassionate execution of their duties. Their worldview, forged in the crucible of emasculation and absolute institutional loyalty, was the invisible gear that allowed the entire dehumanizing machinery to function with such relentless efficiency. The foundational element of the Jing Shi Fang eunuch psychology was the duality of the empire. A eunuch was an incomplete man, a biological dead minus end who could never participate in the most fundamental of human activities, the creation of a family and the continuation of a lineage. This placed them outside the normal bonds of kinship and societal expectation, often making them objects of pity, scorn, or fear. From this position of profound personal lack, they were vested with absolute control over the most vital lineage of all, that of the emperor. They, who could have no sons, were the sole guardians of the process that created the Son of Heaven. This paradox would have been the central, defining reality of their existence. The immense institutional power they wielded was a direct and constant compensation for their personal powerlessness. This made them fiercely protective not of the emperor as a person, but of the system that granted them this vicarious, and otherwise unattainable, form of patriarchal authority. To perform their duties day after day, the clinical inspections, the timed supervision, the physical enforcement of non-minus retention, required the cultivation of an extreme form of professional detachment. They were trained to see their work not as a series of interactions with human beings, but as the execution of an impersonal protocol. The consort was not a woman, but the subject. The emperor was not a man, but the source. This linguistic and mental reframing was a crucial psychological defense mechanism. It allowed the eunuch to divorce his actions from their emotional and moral implications, transforming him into a living instrument of the state's will. He was a technician in a biological laboratory, and his role was to ensure the experiment was conducted according to the established methodology, regardless of the nature of the materials involved. This institutional identity became a powerful substitute for the personal identity they had been forced to surrender. Lacking a family, the Chamber of Imperial Affairs became their clan. Lacking children, the meticulous and ever-minus growing ledger became their progeny, a tangible legacy of their life's work. Their loyalty was directed not to individuals who were transient, but to the institution itself, which was permanent. This fostered a powerful guardian mentality. They were not merely servants, they were the only true, unbiased protectors of the dynastic bloodline. The imperial clans were self-minus interested, the ministers were ambitious, the consorts were competitive, but the eunuchs, with no children to advance, could see themselves as the sole and concubine custodians of the future. This self-minus perception, whether fully justified or not, provided a powerful moral and psychological rationale for their absolute control. Their unique position as both insiders and outsiders also made them consummate observers. They moved through the most private spaces of the Forbidden City, yet they were never truly part of the family. They saw everything, heard everything, but were expected to remain silent, their faces a mask of impassive service. This constant observation, combined with their detachment, made them the ideal intelligence gatherers. They were the human censors of the inner court, collecting data not just on the consorts, but on the emperor's moods, his health, and his private utterances. They understood the subtle shifts in the political climate better than any minister in the outer court, because they witnessed their direct, unfiltered effects on the man at the center of it all. This constant, silent gathering of information was not just a byproduct of their duties, it was an essential to love their power and survival. The eunuch's role as a detached and privileged observer was not merely a psychological byproduct of his station. It was a core, institutionalized function of the Chamber of Imperial Affairs itself. The chamber's purview extended far beyond the biological mechanics of procreation. To effectively manage the imperial succession, it was necessary to manage the entire human and political ecosystem from which that succession arose. The Jing Shi Fang evolved into the central nervous system of the inner court, a sophisticated and highly effective internal intelligence agency. Its official mission was to regulate the emperor's bed. Its unofficial, but equally critical, mission was to ensure total information dominance over the private lives of every significant individual within the Forbidden City's 4,000,000 walls. The data gathered by this clandestine network was comprehensive. On a primary level, it collected physiological intelligence. The chamber maintained meticulous, confidential records on the health of every consort, including her menstrual cycles, her medical history, and any signs of illness, however minor. This was essential for the practical task of compiling the nightly list for the green minus-headed tablets, but it also served as a powerful tool of control. Knowledge of a woman's health was knowledge of her viability and, therefore, her value to the state. This clinical data was supplemented by a constant stream of behavioral and social intelligence. The low-ranking eunuchs and palace maids assigned to each consort's pavilion were the chamber's frontline agents. Their official duties placed them in a position to observe everything, which consorts were forming alliances, which were engaged in bitter rivalries, who received secret messages from their families, and whose temperament was becoming unstable or ambitious. This network was structured with the efficiency of a classic espionage ring. The maids and junior eunuchs acted as field assets, reporting to a mid-level eunuch who served as their handler. This handler would collate the information from several pavilions, filtering out irrelevant gossip and identifying patterns of behavior. These synthesized intelligence reports would then be passed up the chain of command to the chief eunuch himself. This hierarchical structure insulated the leadership from the raw, unfiltered data, and it ensured that information was properly vetted and contextualized before it reached the top. A consort might believe she was confiding in a trusted personal maid, but in reality, she was often speaking directly into the recording device of the state's internal security apparatus. The most valuable intelligence, however, was that which concerned the emperor himself. The senior eunuchs of the Jing Shi Fang, due to their unique and intimate access, were positioned to monitor the emperor's physical and mental state with unparalleled accuracy. They knew when he was in ill health, even if it was concealed from the grand councillors of the outer court. They knew his moods, his private frustrations, and his passing fancies. This psychological profile of the emperor was the most precious commodity in the entire empire. The chief eunuch could use this knowledge to subtly influence events, perhaps by presenting the tablet of a calm, soothing consort on a day when the emperor was known to be agitated, thereby earning his gratitude. He could also use it to protect the system, ensuring that a consort who might take advantage of the emperor's momentary weakness was kept off the list entirely. The purpose of this vast surveillance operation was threefold. The first and most obvious was security. The chamber acted as a preemptive counter-intelligence service, constantly vigilant for any sign of a conspiracy. an unhappy consort, a resentful family, or a secret affair were not just personal dramas, they were potential threats to the emperor's life and the stability of the throne. By monitoring the emotional and political temperature of the inner court, the Jing Shi Fang aimed to identify and neutralize these threats before they could metastasize. The second purpose was the maintenance of order. By understanding the intricate web of alliances and rivalries, the eunuchs could act as political engineers, subtly disrupting factions that were grown to powerful or quietly isolating individuals who were deemed a destabilizing influence. The third purpose was to consolidate their own power. The chief eunuch's exclusive access to this comprehensive intelligence made him an indispensable, if informal, advisor to the emperor. He could provide insight into the court's inner dynamics that no one else could, cementing his position as a trusted, and therefore powerful servant. The Chamber of Imperial Affairs was thus a panopticon at the heart of the empire, a system of total surveillance, ensuring that every action, every whisper, and every secret ambition within the inner court was observed, recorded, and managed. The elaborate system of surveillance and control embodied by the Chamber of Imperial Affairs, while reaching its most refined and bureaucratically perfect from under the king, was not a sudden or novel invention. It was the culmination of 2,000 years of political theory and practical experience, the final, logical iteration of a solution to a problem that had plagued nearly every dynasty in Chinese history. The king emperors and their Manchu ancestors before them were astute students of the past. They had access to the vast imperial libraries, which contained the official histories of their predecessors' chronicles filled with cautionary tales of disputed successions, civil wars sparked by palace intrigue, and entire dynasties brought to their knees by the unchecked influence of the inner court. The Jing Shi Fang was not conceived in a vacuum. It was forged in the shadow of historical failures. The problem's roots extend back to the Han Dynasty, China's first great long-lasting imperial period. The Han court struggled constantly with the power of empresses and their formidable clans. An empress dowager, acting as regent for a young emperor, could effectively become the supreme ruler, packing the government with her own male relatives and marginalizing the imperial Liu family. The reign of Empress Liu Ji, the widow of the founding emperor, was a particularly stark example that became required reading for future rulers. Her ruthless consolidation of power on behalf of her own Liu clan after her husband's death served as a foundational lesson in the dangers of allowing a consort's family to become too entrenched. The Han experience demonstrated that the imperial marriage was not a private union but could activate the latent power of that alliance, often with destabilizing consequences. Centuries later, the Tang Dynasty provided an even more dramatic set of warnings. The Tang court, known for its cosmopolitanism and relative social openness, also witnessed the most extreme examples of female power in Chinese history. The most notable case was that of Wu Zetian, a concubine of Emperor Taizong, who rose to become the wife of his son, Emperor Gaozong, and eventually declared herself empress regnant of her own Zhou dynasty, the only woman to ever own Zhou dynasty, the only woman to ever hold the title of sovereign in her own right. Her unprecedented ascension, while a testament to her extraordinary political skill, was a terrifying precedent for orthodox Confucian scholars and subsequent rulers. It was the ultimate demonstration of the threat posed by a woman of ambition in the inner court. The tale of young Guifei, the beloved consort of Emperor Xuanzong, provided a different kind of lesson. The emperor's infatuation with her led to the meteoric rise of her relatives, particularly her cousin Yang Jiuzong, to the highest positions in government. The corruption and resentment fostered by their power was a major contributing factor to the catastrophic Unlushan Rebellion, a period of civil strife that marked the beginning of the Tang Dynasty's decline. In reaction to the chaos of the late Tang, the subsequent Song Dynasty saw a turn toward a more conservative, inward-looking statecraft, heavily influenced by the rise of Neo-Confucianism. This philosophical movement emphasized social order, strict hierarchies, and the clear delineation of roles. Within this framework, the subordination of women was a key tenet of a well-ordered society. The Song court began to formalize and bureaucratize the management of the imperial household to a greater degree than its predecessors. While their systems lacked the clinical precision of the king, They laid the ideological groundwork for treating the inner court not as a family, but as a government department to be administered with rules and regulations. The most direct institutional predecessor to the Qing system was found in the Ming Dynasty. The Ming emperors, deeply paranoid and autocratic, placed immense trust in eunuchs as a counterweight to the powerful scholar-official bureaucracy. This led to the creation of vast and feared eunuch-run secret police and intelligence agencies, such as the Eastern Depot. The Ming institutionalized the use of eunuchs in managing every facet of the Forbidden City. The king, upon conquering China, inherited this Ming palace infrastructure, including its large and well-organized eunuch population. They observed the Ming model closely, learning from both its successes and its failures. They saw that eunuchs could be loyal servants of the throne, but also that their power, if unchecked, could become a corrupting and destabilizing force in its own right. The king's solution was to retain the Ming concept of eunuch administration, but to encase it in an even more rigid and impersonal system of rules. The Jing Shi Fang was their refinement, a bureaucracy designed to be more powerful than any individual eunuch who ran it, a machine of protocol that would, in theory, be immune to the human flaws that had brought down so many dynasties before. The emperor's decree of Liu, duly recorded in the silk-bound ledger, was not the end of the chamber's involvement, but the beginning of a new rigorous phase of surveillance. It was a single character that transformed a consort from a temporary partner into a vessel of the state's future. From that moment, the woman and her body became a dynastic asset of the highest priority. Her health, her diet, her every movement were now matters of intense official interest. In coordination with the imperial physicians, would monitor her with a vigilance that bordered on clinical obsession. A successful conception, confirmed in the subsequent weeks, was not a private joy to be celebrated within her family. It was a significant political event, the successful outcome of a state-sanctioned procedure. Upon the confirmation of a pregnancy, the consort's status within the inner court underwent a fundamental and immediate reclassification. This was the ultimate prize in the relentless competition of the rear palace, and the system rewarded it accordingly. Her official rank was almost always elevated, sometimes by several degrees. A mid-level concubine could find herself promoted to the status of a senior consort overnight. This promotion was not merely symbolic. It came with a tangible increase in her daily stipend of silver, an expansion of her personal retinue of maids and eunuchs, and an allocation of finer silks, more luxurious foods, and often a more spacious and well-appointed pavilion. These material rewards were a public declaration of her new value. She had succeeded where hundreds of others had failed, and the hierarchy of the court formed around her success. Her family in the outer court would also be the beneficiaries of this new standing, often receiving imperial titles, land grants, or favorable government appointments. However, this elevation in status came at the cost of any remaining personal autonomy. The pregnant consort became the subject of an elaborate security and health protocol. Her diet was strictly prescribed by imperial physicians to ensure the health of the fetus. Her movements were restricted, her interactions with others carefully monitored by the eunuchs of the Jing Shi Fang to prevent any possibility of harm, whether accidental or intentional. In an environment rife with jealousy, the risk of a rival consort attempting to induce a miscarriage through poison, a contrived accident, or even dark magic was considered a constant and serious threat. The pregnant consort lived in a gilded cage within the larger gilded cage of the Forbidden City, protected and controlled in equal measure. The birth of the child, particularly if it was a son, marked the final and most profound stage of the mother's transformation. She was now the mother of a prince, a dragon's son. This status conferred upon her a level of prestige and security that was unassailable. She had fulfilled her ultimate function, and in doing so, had become a permanent and respected figure in the court's power structure. Yet, the culmination of her ambition was also the beginning of a new and painful separation. According to the strict protocols of the Qing court, the imperial princes were not raised by their birth mothers. Shortly after birth, the infant prince was taken from his mother and placed in the care of a separate establishment within the Forbidden City, the A-GSUO, or the prince's quarters. This was a dedicated institution staffed by a carefully selected team of wet nurses or mars and eunuchs. The mother was permitted only limited, scheduled visits with her own child. This policy of separation was a deliberate and calculated political strategy, a lesson learned from the hard experience of previous dynasties. By removing the prince from his mother's daily influence, the court sought to prevent the formation of an overly strong emotional bond that could be exploited for political purposes. The goal was to raise a son of the dynasty, not the son of a particular woman or a particular clan. His primary loyalty was to be to the emperor and the state, not to his maternal relatives. His education, his friendships, and his entire worldview were to be shaped by the state-controlled environment of the prince's quarters, wishing you a pleasant experience. Thus, the approved heir from the moment of his birth ceased to be a child and became a political entity, a living symbol of his mother's success and a pawn in the ongoing strategic games of the court. His life was one of immense privilege, but also of profound isolation and constant danger. He was a target for the resentments of rival factions, and his every action was scrutinized for its political implication. The success of the Chamber of Imperial Affairs mission, the creation of a legitimate heir, did not resolve the tensions of the court. It merely shifted the focus of those tensions onto a new generation. The birth of a prince was not the end of the competition, it was the start of a new, even more complex and dangerous phase of the dynastic struggle. To fully comprehend the mechanisms of the Chamber of Imperial Affairs is to move beyond the political and into the physiological. The protocols it enforced, from the timing of the emperor's encounter to the post-coital procedures performed on the consorts, were not arbitrary acts of control. They were the practical application of a sophisticated and internally consistent system of medical and anatomical theory as it was understood in pre-modern China. The Jing Shi Fang was not just a bureaucracy. It was a bio-political laboratory, and its eunuchs were merely clerks but technicians of the body. Their work rested on the foundational belief that the human form was a system of energies, essences, and channels that could and should be managed for the benefit of the state. The primary medical concern governing the entire process was the preservation of the emperor's health, which was inextricably linked to his Jing or vital essence. In the framework of traditional Chinese medicine, Jing was considered the most fundamental substance of life, a finite reserve of energy inherited from one's parents that determined one's constitution, vitality, and longevity. It was the material basis for reproduction, but it was also the fuel for all other life activities. Every act of sexual union was believed to consume a significant amount of the emperor's Jing. Therefore, excessive or unregulated sexual activity was not seen as a moral failing, but as a grave medical and political risk. It would deplete the emperor's vital essence, leading to physical weakness, mental exhaustion, diminished capacity for governance, and ultimately, a premature death. The hourglass on the eunuch's table was, in this context, a medical instrument, ensuring that the emperor expended only the prescribed amount of his vital essence, conserving his strength for the arduous tasks of ruling the vast empire. When the emperor's decree was bu, the focus of this medical system shifted from the body of the emperor to the body of the consort. The procedure known as the application of external force was a direct manipulation of the body's energetic pathways or meridians. Traditional anatomical charts depicted a complex network of channels through which qi, or vital energy, flowed. Specific points along these meridians, known as acupoints, were considered gateways that could be stimulated to influence the flow of qi and, by extension, the function of the internal organs. The eunuchs of the Jing Shi Fang were trained in a specialized form of prayer focused on the points in the lower abdomen believed to govern the uterus. The anatomical target was a point on the conception vessel meridian, a central channel running up the front of the body. By applying deep, sustained pressure to this specific location, the eunuch technician aimed to achieve a twofold effect. First, the intense stimulation was intended to create a powerful and localized disruption in the consort's qi. This energetic disturbance would render the womb an inhospitable environment, preventing the emperor's dragon seed from taking root. The womb needed a state of calm, balanced energy to allow for conception. The procedure was designed to introduce a controlled form of energetic chaos. Second, the physical pressure was meant to induce powerful uterine contractions. From a mechanistic perspective, The goal was to physically compel the body to expel the seminal fluid before fertilization and implantation could occur. The procedure was a physical override of the body's natural reproductive processes, using a precise knowledge of its energetic and muscular systems. This physical intervention was almost always followed by a chemical one. The herbal decoctions given to the consort were not placebos. They were potent pharmacological formulas designed to complete the cleansing process. The ingredients of these formulas would have been selected by imperial physicians for their specific properties within the traditional materia medica. They typically included herbs believed to invigorate the blood and dispel stosses, effectively promoting strong blood flow through the pelvic region to ensure a complete flushing of the uterine lining. Other ingredients might be included for their cooling properties, to counteract any inflammation or heat generated by the procedure and the sexual encounter. This herbal supplement was the final step in a comprehensive, multi-stage process designed to reset the consort's body to its baseline state, ensuring no conception occurred and preparing her for potential future service. The entire system, from the hourglass to the acaspre to the herbal tea, was a testament to a worldview in which the human body was a legible and malleable text, one that could be edited and rewritten by those who held both the knowledge and the authority to do so. Despite the system's foundation in a comprehensive medical theory and its execution through a rigid, multi-layered bureaucracy, the Chamber of Imperial Affairs was not an infallible machine. No system designed and operated by human beings, regardless of its internal logic or the severity of its enforcement, can ever be entirely immune to the unpredictable variables of human nature, error, ambition, desire, and simple biological chance. While the official histories and the surviving court records present a picture of seamless and absolute control, they are, by their nature, documents that record successes and approved outcomes. The failures, the circumventions, and the near misses were likely suppressed, their records destroyed, and the individuals involved silenced to protect the system's formidable reputation for omnipotence. The single greatest point of potential failure within the entire apparatus was, paradoxically, its center, the emperor himself. The system was designed to regulate him, but it ultimately derived its authority from his acquiescence. A compliant emperor, content to operate within the established protocols, made the system function smoothly. A willful emperor, however, possessed the theoretical authority to override it. An emperor who developed a particularly strong emotional attachment to one consort could, in theory, shatter the protocol. He could refuse to use the green-headed tablets and simply demand the presence of a specific woman. He could dismiss the time-keeping eunuch from his post outside the door. He could refuse to answer the pivotal question of keep or not to keep, thereby creating a state of administrative limbo. Such an act of imperial defiance would have constituted a crisis of the highest order within the inner court. It would have pitted the emperor's personal, absolute authority against the impersonal, institutional authority of the chamber. The eunuchs would be faced with an impossible choice: obey a direct command from the Son of Heaven that violated their sacred duty, or defy the emperor in the name of upholding the dynastic laws he was meant to embody. The historical record is largely silent on such direct confrontations, suggesting they were or that the system was robust enough, and the emperor's conditioning thorough enough to prevent them. It is more likely that an emperor's resistance would manifest in more subtle ways, such as consistently choosing the same woman night after night, a form of passive resistance that worked within the rules while still signaling a powerful preference. A second potential vector for failure was deliberate collusion. A highly ambitious consort, in league with a corruptible eunuch from the chamber, could theoretically attempt a system. This would have been a conspiracy of the highest risk. For example, a eunuch could be bribed to make a false entry in the ledger, recording a keep decree when the emperor had said do not keep. For this to succeed, however, it would require the complicity of not just the record-keeper, but also the eunuch who administered the post-coital procedure. The system's compatibility of duties served as a security check. A conspiracy would require multiple points of failure, exponentially increasing the risk of discovery. The penalty for such a transgression would be absolute, a slow and agonizing death for the eunuch, and the complete extermination of the consort's family, down to the most distant cousins. The potential reward placing one's clan in line for the throne was the only prize great enough to even contemplate such a gamble. The third, and perhaps most plausible, point of failure was simply biological. The contraceptive methods employed by the chamber, while based on a sophisticated understanding of traditional medicine, were not infallible. The application of Acasprea and the administration of herbal decoctions were not guaranteed to be 100% effective. It is a statistical certainty that, over the decades of the dynasty's existence, there must have been instances where a consort became pregnant despite a recorded decree of BUU. Such an event would be a profound crisis, as the pregnancy itself would be living evidence of either the system's fallibility or, more dangerously, the consort's infidelity. In such a scenario, the institutional response would have been swift, silent, and absolute. The pregnancy would not be allowed to come to term. It was an unapproved, unrecorded biological event, an error in the state's accounting that had to be corrected. The consort would be isolated, and imperial physicians, under the direct and secret order of the chamber, would have administered potent, irreversible abortifacients. The woman herself, now a liability and a living reminder of the system's imperfection, would likely be removed from the court. She might be sent to the cold palace, a desolate section of the Forbidden City reserved for disgraced consorts to live out her days in isolation. Or she might simply disappear, her official record showing a sudden death from illness. The primary objective would be to erase the failure, leaving the pristine, unblemished ledger as the only surviving, and therefore official, version of the truth. The meticulously balanced and male-dominated ecosystem of the Chamber of Imperial Affairs faced its most profound and sustained challenge during the latter half of the 19th century. This challenge did not come from a rebellious emperor or a foreign power, but from within the inner court itself, in the form of a woman who would rise from the rank of a low-level concubine to become the de facto ruler of the Qing Empire for nearly 5 decades. And her long regency fundamentally altered the dynamics of the system, forcing the eunuchs of the Jing Shi Fang to adapt their ancient protocols to a new and unprecedented concentration of female power. Qixi did not dismantle the chamber, but she learned to master its rules and, in time, bend them to her own formidable will. Qixi entered the Forbidden City in 1852 as a concubine to the Xianfeng Emperor. She was one of dozens of women competing for the emperor's attention within the rigid framework managed by the Jing Shi Fang. She understood, with a pragmatism that would define her entire career, that her only path to lasting influence was through the birth of a male heir. She successfully navigated the treacherous politics of the inner court, cultivated the necessary relationships with key eunuchs, and managed to secure the emperor's favor. In 1856, she achieved her primary objective. She gave birth to Zi Chun, the emperor's only surviving son. This single biological event, duly recorded and sanctioned by the Chamber of Imperial Affairs, was the foundational act of her rise to power. It transformed her from an ambitious concubine into the mother of the heir apparent, a position of immense and unassailable prestige. When the Xianfeng Emperor died in 1861, Qixi's 5-year-old son ascended the throne as the Tongzi Chi Emperor. In a brilliant political maneuver, Qixi allied herself with the late emperor's principal wife, the Empress Xian, and launched a palace coup that ousted the board of regents the emperor had appointed on his deathbed. Qixi and Xian became co-minus regents for the young emperor, ruling from behind the curtain. As the mother of the emperor, however, Qixi held the ultimate source of legitimacy and quickly became the dominant figure in the regency. This was a seismic shift in the court's power structure. The emperor, the biological and political center of the Jing Shi Fang's universe, was now a child, and the ultimate authority resided with a woman, his mother. This new reality forced a significant change in the chamber's function. While the protocols surrounding the young emperor's future sex life were maintained in theory, awaiting his maturity, the true center of political gravity in the inner court was now Qixi's own court. The chief eunuch of the chamber, a master of reading political tides, would have understood that his primary duty was no longer simply to manage the imperial succession in the abstract, but to serve and remain in the favor of the Empress Dowager. Qixi, for her part, had an intimate understanding of the eunuch bureaucracy. She had spent years as a competitor within their system and knew exactly how it worked, where its levels of power were, and how to exploit them. She cultivated her own network of loyal eunuchs, elevating men like Ndi Hai and later Liu Yan Ying to positions of immense personal influence, effectively creating a parallel power structure that bypassed the old, formal hierarchies of the chamber. When her son, the Tongzi Emperor, came of age and took control of the government, the chamber's traditional role was briefly restored. They managed his selection of an empress and various consorts according to the ancient rituals. However, Cixi's influence remained paramount. She frequently clashed with her son and deeply disliked his chosen empress, creating immense tension within the inner court. The emperor's mysterious and premature death in 1875, officially from smallpox but rumored to be from syphilis, plunged the court into another succession crisis. It was a crisis that Cixi resolved with breathtaking audacity. In a move that shattered imperial succession law, Cixi bypassed the next generation of the imperial clan and selected her 3-year-old nephew as the new emperor, who would be known as the Guangxu Emperor. Because the new emperor was her nephew, she could adopt him as her son and legitimately continue her role as regent. This was the ultimate manipulation of the bloodline. The Chamber of Imperial Affairs, whose entire purpose was to ensure a direct father-to-son succession, was powerless to stop it. Their ledgers and protocols were rendered irrelevant by a raw act of political will from the woman who now controlled the state. For the remainder of her life, Cixi was the undisputed center of the empire. The Jing Shi Fang continued to exist, managing the Guangxu Emperor's tightly controlled and ultimately tragic intimate life, but it did so as an instrument of the Empress Dowager's policy. Its authority no longer flowed from ancient tradition alone, but from the consent and command of the woman who had once been a mere name on one of its green Midas-headed tablets. The long, twilight regency of Empress Dowager Cixi, while representing the apex of her personal power, coincided with the inexorable decline of the dynasties she governed. The Qing Empire in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was assailed by existential threats from all sides. Externally, it faced the relentless pressure of foreign imperialism, suffering a series of military defeats and signing humiliating treaties that ceded territory, sovereignty, and economic control. It was racked by vast, bloody rebellions, widespread social unrest, and the rise of revolutionary illegitimacy of the imperial system. In this new and terrifying world of global politics and mass movements, the ancient, inward-looking concerns of the Chamber of Imperial Affairs began to seem increasingly anachronistic. The meticulous control of the imperial bloodline, a matter of paramount importance for centuries, became a secondary concern when the survival of the entire imperial edifice was at stake. The personal tragedy of the Guangxu Emperor, who lived his adult life as a political prisoner under Cixi's watchful eye following his attempt at reform in 1898, further eroded the chamber's relevance. The emperor's intimate life, like every other aspect of his existence, was controlled by Cixi. He had an empress, Jing Feng, who was his cousin and Cixi's own niece, a political match he detested. He also had to consort. The Jing Shi Fang would have continued its nightly rituals, the presentation of the green Midas-headed tablets, the timed encounters, the notations in the ledger, but these actions were now hollow formalities. They were a performance of a traditional duty in a court where the true power dynamics had rendered the outcome meaningless. The emperor was a sovereign with no power, and his potential heirs, had he produced any, would have been born into a gilded cage, their fates entirely in the hands of the aging Empress Dowager. The biological imperative that had driven the chamber's work for generations had been replaced by a political stalemate. The death of both the Guangxu Emperor and Empress Dowager Cixi, within a day of each other in November 1908, marked the definitive end of an era. With her dying breath, Cixi appointed Puyi, the 2-year-old nephew of the Guangxu Emperor, as the next in line to the throne. The dragon throne was once again occupied by an infant, but this time there was no powerful regent to hold the fracturing state together. The old systems of the inner court, including the Chamber of Imperial Affairs, continued to operate out of sheer institutional inertia, but they were now ghosts, their purpose and authority evaporating with each passing day. The eunuchs would have continued to maintain their ledgers and protocols, but they were now the administrators of a lineage that had no political future. The final blow came with the Xinhua Revolution in 1911. The uprising, which began with a mutiny in Wuchang, quickly spread across the country as provinces declared their independence from the Qing court. The ancient imperial system, which had endured for over 2 millennia, collapsed with breathtaking speed. In February 1912, the new regents, acting on behalf of the child emperor Puyi, signed the imperial edict of abdication. The Qing Dynasty was officially over, and the Republic of China was born. For the Chamber of Imperial Affairs, this was not a dramatic, violent end, but a quiet, administrative dissolution. The emperor was gone, the state he embodied was gone, and so, the bureaucracy that existed solely to manage his succession had lost its reason for being. According to the terms of the abdication, Puyi was permitted to continue living in the northern part of the Forbidden City for a time, retaining his imperial title but holding no governmental power. The inner court continued to exist in a strange, suspended state, a phantom of its former self. The eunuchs of the Jing Shi Fang, along with thousands of other palace servants, found themselves in a state of limbo. Their skills, honed over generations for a single, specific purpose, were now obsolete. The ledgers they had so meticulously guarded were now just historical artifacts, their entries detailing the genesis of a dynasty that had no more heirs to give. When the warlord Feng Yuxiang expelled Puyi and his court from the Forbidden City for good, the remaining eunuchs were scattered, taking the last living memories of the chamber's arcane rituals with them into the new, chaotic world of the Republic. The heavy silk bound registers, the silver trays, and the green headed tablets were left behind, relics of a system of control that had been rendered utterly powerless by the unstoppable force of history. When the last emperor was expelled from the Forbidden City, the Chamber of Imperial Affairs ceased to exist, not with a proclamation, but with the quiet turning of locks on doors that would no longer be opened, is not found in these physical relics. It is found in its perfection of a concept that lies at the dark heart of many systems of absolute power, the bureaucracy of the body. It was the ultimate expression of the state's claim of ownership over the biological processes of the individual, the reduction of human life to a series of administrative procedures. The chamber's entire existence was predicated on the systematic depersonalization of its participants. The Emperor, the Son of Heaven, was conceptualized not as a man, but as the primary biological asset of the dynasty. His body was a national resource, and his vital essence, his Jing, was a strategic reserve to be conserved and deployed according to a long-term plan. The protocols of the chamber, the limited choices, the temporal constraints, the lack of privacy were all designed to separate the man from the office, to ensure that his personal desires or affections could never interfere with his primary function as the progenitor of the next emperor. He was the initiator of the process, but he was granted no ownership over its product. The consorts in turn were transformed from individuals into standardized, interchangeable units of reproduction. The ritual of preparation was a process of erasure. Her name, her rank, her personal scent, all the markers of her identity were stripped away until only a purified, anonymous female body remained. The act of being wrapped in a quilt and carried to the imperial bed was the final physical manifestation of this objectification. She was not a partner arriving for an encounter. She was a vessel being delivered to a laboratory to be utilized and then returned. Her body was the site of the state's most critical work, and as such, it was subject to the state's most invasive procedures, from the security inspection to the physically enforced contraception. The eunuchs were the system's ideal administrators, men whose own bodies had been irrevocably altered in service to the throne. Their physical state was seen as a guarantee of their neutrality, a permanent barrier to the nepotistic ambitions that plagued officials in the outer court. This made them the perfect technicians of the body. They could handle, inspect, and manipulate the bodies of others with a clinical detachment that was rooted in their own unique and isolated existence. They were the sterile guardians of fertility, the living embodiment of the system's cold, impersonal logic. Their power was immense, but it was entirely institutional. They were the priests of a biological right, but they were also merely the most trusted gears in the machine. Ultimately, the entire complex edifice of rituals, surveillance, and medical intervention served a single bureaucratic purpose: to produce the ledger. The imperial ledger of intimacy was the system's magnum opus. It was the triumph of the written record over the messy, ambiguous, and unverifiable reality of human relationships. In the world of the Jing Shi Fang, legitimacy was not a biological fact. It was an heir not because he was born of the emperor, but because a eunuch had recorded the emperor's decree of keep on a specific page on a specific date. The ledger transformed the act of procreation into a verifiable, auditable, and legally defensible transaction. It was the final and most profound expression of the bureaucracy of the body, a quiet testament to the belief that even the spark of life itself could be, and should be, captured, catalogued, and controlled by the state. The great ledgers of the Chamber of Imperial Affairs are now museum pieces. Their silk covers faded, the ink on their pages a relic of a dead system. The rituals they describe seem impossibly distant, the product of a world with a logic utterly alien to our own. Yet, the fundamental impulse that created the chamber is not a historical artifact. It is the timeless desire for certainty, for order, and for the control of that which is most uncontrollable, the future. The system was a monumental attempt to defeat contingency, to guarantee the orderly succession of power from one generation to the next by seizing control of the biological process at its very source. It was a machine built from fear of chaos, fear of usurpation, fear of the disruptive power of human emotion. And in its quest to eliminate that fear, it paid the highest possible price: the suppression of individuality, intimacy. Under this system became a vast and intricate clockwork, each person a gear with a designated function, all turning in perfect, sterile harmony. While the eunuchs were meticulously managing the dynasty's genesis, the world outside the Vermilion Walls was being remade by forces their ledgers could not account for. The system they perfected was designed to protect the bloodline from internal threats, but it left the empire itself vulnerable, an isolated, unrigid structure in a fluid and unforgiving world. The silence in those halls today is a testament to that ultimate failure. The machine designed to ensure permanence ultimately presided over an ending. The names change, the dates are different, but the echoes of these events can still be heard today. If you listen carefully enough, the lesson is now yours.